Hello, welcome to today's video. We're going to continue the discussion of the history of the Polish Carpathian Independent Brigade. Now, in Polish, the name is actually Samodzielna Brigada Strzelców Karpacki. Now, the reason I bring that up is to explain that I'm probably going to be referring to the unit by the abbreviation SBSK going forward. It's easier for me to say. That's what I'm used to calling it. Calling it the Carpathians, or actually saying Carpathian Independent Brigade, just seems a little bit harder. So we're going to call it, talk about the brigade or the SBSK. And so as a result, I just want to kind of lay that in front of this video. But where we are is we've just began the journey from French Syria, now Vichy French Syria, into British Palestine, where the Poles were, along with the Free French that were leaving Vichy-controlled space, they all made it to Palestine. And in the case of the Polish, they brought their equipment, their French equipment. They brought their trucks, the guns, the machine guns, you name it, all the equipment. And remember, this unit was essentially a mountain fighting unit, so they were equipped as such. And they were again an army on foreign soil, and again with the agreement they have in place with Britain, they were going to be an independent Polish unit operating alongside the British under the British unit hierarchy, but it's a Polish unit. They would get their orders from the Polish army, essentially being seconded to the British. So what happens now, we're in a situation where Britain is in a really bad spot. As I may have mentioned already, the British have just lost most of their vehicles and heavy equipment as a result of the Dunkirk evacuation. The British picked up all that stuff and put it to good use. But the British were in really no position at this point to reinforce this theater of war, the Mediterranean. But they had some really strong and important assets between Gibraltar, Malta, and Egypt, ports of Alexandria, the Suez Canal, very strategically important. Now, the decision was made for the British to bolster the strength of the forces there by bringing in troops from essentially the Commonwealth, India, New Zealand, and Australia specifically. They also brought in some troops from South Africa over time. The brigade is in a position right now where they're in the process of being re-equipped. They were a mountain brigade, mountain infantry brigade under French control. Now they're being reorganized along the lines of a motorized British infantry unit, in this case brigade. So they have to re-equip some things. They're going to need Bren carriers. They're going to need more trucks than what just the French ones they've got. They're going to need their own artillery pieces. All the stuff that makes up a motorized infantry brigade needs to be pooled in. Now, fortunately, with all the Commonwealth units already there, and the pressure kind of off because Italy kind of hasn't pressed home their advantage, the Poles are able to kind of reorganize. Now, this didn't get too far before Italy decided to launch its attack into Egypt. So on September 9th, the Italian mechanized infantry, as well as some of their armored units, and some of the regular infantry begin their march east into Egypt, taking the British really off guard. No, they weren't really expecting it. Some minor skirmishes, there were some British losses. Fortunately for the British, the Italians never really pushed their advantage because from the Italian perspective, they had some gains, but they didn't have enough time to prepare those gains for defensive action because the mechanized troops were able to move up pretty quickly, but the regular infantry weren't. And so they needed to buy time for the infantry to get up, catch up, do the defensive works before they could plan the next effective offensive. So this bought the British some time, which is a very good thing. just it prevented more threats against, for example, Alexandria, which is a very important city in Egypt. Whether it's remember it's a port, and so you've got port facilities, you have military facilities, and you have cultural center in Egypt that had to be protected. Now, as a result of that importance, the brigade was tasked to defend Alexandria. So they were moved into Alexandria, and that was their base of operations. That was their defensive positions, and that's where they would stand should the Italians press their attack forward. Now, the British were obviously going to be counterattacking. There were several operations that occurred. There were some successes and some failures in the process, but it was fighting going on, and it wasn't decisive at any point. British gains were quickly turned back around. Italian gains were quickly turned back. So a lot of seesawing already in this desert campaign. Well, not long after, here at the end of October, Italy decides to invade Greece as well. Now, of course, that didn't go so well for the Italians. In fact, the Greeks were able to push the Italians back into Albania and take Albanian territory before finally having to give that up and get pushed back in the mountains. This put Britain in an awkward position. They were forced to fight the Italians in Egypt, but now they had a British ally who was under threat from the Axis. They didn't have a lot of units that could help. In all honesty, I mean, they didn't want to split their forces too much, but they needed to help. And so, as the situation developed toward the end of the year, and the fighting in Greece became more of a stalemate than anything else, the British thought this is an opportunity where they can push with their troops by supporting the Greeks, pushing troops into Greece, pushing the Italians back, and then securing Greece for the Allies. This would have been obviously a diplomatic coup, because we're showing the world that the British Army is still able to fight and willing to take the fight to the enemy, especially in the protection of their allies. This would have been very good. So, at the start of the year, 1941, it was decided to send some New Zealand troops and some of the Royal Tank Regiment's units up into Greece to start pushing back the Italians. And so January and February, a lot of those forces went out there and did that. All the while, British forces are holding the line against the Italians and dealing with the contests in Egypt. Well, things are developing well from the British perspective, and so in April there was talks early. There were talks about the Polish being taken out of Alexandria and also sent over to Greece to help the Greece and continue the push against Italy to secure Greece. Unfortunately, on the 6th of April, Germany launched its attacks into both Greece out of Bulgaria and Yugoslavia through Hungary and Romania. And in all these cases, the goal was to help the Italians at conquering Greece. And they had to move the Germans had to get through the Metaxas line first in northeastern Greece to begin any attempt at moving toward Athens. But the rest of the German army would have to move through Yugoslavia to get down to the border of Greece to, again, begin the movements toward Athens. So those first couple weeks of April were kind of difficult, but the Poles were going to be committed. And so they started loading their equipment and vehicles onto transports and were ready to set sail, except for the infantry being loaded up, which was going to happen the next day, when the situation began to deteriorate, and Germany was essentially mopping up the operations in Greece. And so it was decided to cancel the deployment to Greece. And again, now we have another situation where the Poles, in a fortunate turn of events, avoided an opportunity to lose equipment and men. Remember, the equipment was going to be relatively hard to replace because, again, Britain can only repair or replace it at a certain speed because they've got their own equipment to replace. But worse was the Polish manpower. The only way to replace men in the brigade was to use Polish troops that have made their way to Palestine over the intervening months. And this is a trickle, so there's not a lot of replacements available at a moment's notice. So they kind of dodged a bullet, and so on April 30th, they were pulled away, disembarked completely, and moved to the British-controlled fortress of Mersa Matura. I believe that's how you pronounce it. Mersa Matura. Anyway, here's what it looks like in letters. Okay. So this is on April 30th. They move into this position. This position is west of Alexandria, and it is a defensive position that they are going to strengthen. They're going to spend 10 weeks doing that. They did a very good job. It was noted that they performed well in that task of bolstering defenses. But at this point, the British realized they had a problem. You see, the Germans had been sponsoring a pro-Axis coup in Iraq. Now, Iraq is just to the northeast of Syria, and again, in the area that would be threatening the Palestine and Transjordan area, which is the backyard of the British down there in that Middle East. So they wanted to stir up a coup here so that they'd have access to the oil in Iraq, as well as putting pressure on Britain from that direction. Well, the way they did this is they sent the Luftwaffe and Regina Aeronautica aircraft into French Syria using Vichy bases there to launch supporting attacks for the coup in Iraq. British were not liking this at all. They realized this is a serious threat to British security in that Middle East. So they were successful in eventually putting the coup down, but they realized they had to deal with French Syria. Essentially, Vichy France, though neutral-ish, was really an ally to Germany and was allowing Germany to access its locations, right, its facilities. That borders on ally. So this was bad for the British. The British said they weren't going to have this. They couldn't have an enemy in the back door, right? So they decided they were going to invade French Syria and take it over from the Vichy French, and they started making plans. Well, one of the units they decided was going to participate in this was the Polish Carpathian Brigade. Yep, the SBSK was going to be joining the fight, not against Germany, but against French Syria. Well, when General Sikorsky found out about this, he immediately contacted Colonel Kapansky, who was the brigade commander, and ordered him to stay put. You see, the Polish and the French had been allies for centuries, literally, even when the nation as it wasn't in place anymore between the late 1700s and 1918. The French were very supportive of the Polish desire to create their nation back, even going back to Napoleon. Napoleon actually reestablished the Duchy of Warsaw. But anyway, for centuries now, the two countries were strong allies, and the Polish were not going to take up arms against their ally. They weren't at war with them. They were at war with Germany, and they weren't going to fight. So now this was entirely within their legal rights because, remember, this is an independent Polish army located in the Middle East. They're controlled by the Polish government in exile, which is in Britain at this point, and they'll make up their mind about how and where the Polish units would be deployed. So it was decided they're not going to take part. British had to make other plans. This operation was still a success, but at least in this particular case, the Polish avoided another chance to lose men and equipment in combat against a foe that wasn't Germany. That was going to be, in my opinion, that is actually was a positive outcome. Well, with that, once that operation was finished, it was June 8th it started, and it was wrapped up by, I believe, June 17th. Well, the Poles kept doing their work in their little fortress defense location, and they then received orders to go into rest and refit in Alexandria. So in July, they moved out of the front line, if you will, back to Alexandria for rest and refit. Now, what this meant was obviously time off away from the frontline duties and threats and that constant state of alert. But they also had an opportunity now to replace more of their French equipment with British equipment. It wasn't 100% replacement. They still had some French 75s, for example, but all the AT guns were replaced with 2-pounders by this point. They were mostly equipped with 25-pounders, just had a few straggling 75s left. Of course, they had all the small arms and machine guns, mortars were all already British, and their vehicles were upgraded, they're brought up to snuff, and they're all British again, except for some of the trucks. So here it is, July. The unit's getting refit, and now a new diplomatic situation is occurring, but this time between Australia and England. See, Australia has a militia force, and that militia force is their professional army. But their constitution basically says that that army cannot fight outside the boundaries of Australia itself. The only ones who are allowed to operate outside of Australia were those who volunteer. So just like in World War I, the Australians went ahead and created their second Australian infantry formation, I think is what they called it, or infantry force. It was a force of all volunteers. Some of them were actually volunteering out of the militia into these units, and these were going to be the units that ended up in North Africa, even back in 1940. Well, anyway, all of these units, all of those divisions were sent west. They weren't in Australia, but Japan was becoming more aggressive, and it looked like they were going to start turning south, and they were going to threaten, potentially invade Australia. Because if you think about it, remember, Japan is wanting the resources in Southeast Asia, especially oil, and Australia. Well, they've got a strong army. They've been very successful so far. They would be able to land on Australian shores. And the Australians wanted to make sure they had their men there to defend them. So there were negotiations with the British to start pulling their units back out of the Middle East and send them back to Australia. Britain eventually did agree. They were going to do that in an orderly fashion. They weren't just going to pick them up all and leave right away. They were going to rotate them out. And in fact, it would take a couple of years to finish all the deployments back to Australia. However, one of the key moves that had to occur was I believe it was the 18th Australian Brigade, which was locked in a siege in Tobruk. Remember, Rommel's been fighting. You have several British operations and German operations with a seesaw of engagements back and forth across western Libya. And in the last push Rommel had, they surrounded Tobruk, and several British units and the 18th Brigade, Australian Brigade, were in Tobruk. Well, they needed to be pulled out, so it was decided to send the SBSK into Tobruk to replace those units. In addition, some of the British units that were still there were going to be replaced with fresh British troops. There would only be a few Australians left in Tobruk when this move was done. So the brigade, again, started loading up its transports in August, and between August 19th and 28th, they would make their way into Tobruk and slowly begin to take the places of the Australians in their positions. So with that, we'll go ahead and pause here today, and next we will talk about their deployment in Tobruk, how the Australians found them, what was their opinion, and we'll talk about the action that occurred as a result of their operation in Tobruk. So we will, again, keep these short, so it's relatively speaking short. You'll be able to digest these in small packets. If you think that this should be one longer video, let me know, but try to make this a little bit more accessible to regular viewers. Again, next week we'll pick up with Tobruk. We'll continue their actions beyond that, and then we'll eventually get into how do you model this unit through its history, because even to the point of talking about the what ifs. What if they were engaged in combat against the Italians in in September or October of 1940? What if they did fight in Greece? Those kind of things. And of course, other what ifs between September 1940 and eventually summer of 1942. All right. So with that, I'll leave you this week, and share, like, subscribe. Let me know if other special units you might be interested for me to cover in this series, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.